Welcome. Do come in. So glad you could finally join us. What's that? Why, of course we've been expecting you. We heard of your approach from an old crow who had stopped by. Well, don't be shy. Come in. Make yourself comfortable. The tea is almost ready. Or do you prefer something with a little more spirit in it? Oh, pardon. I get excited when we have company and I sometimes forget. You've come with a purpose. You've come for a story. Well, sit down and we'll get started. I used to love nursery rhymes as a child, as I'm sure is true of many children. Small stories of fantastical worlds and wondrous people, and such colorful language. Words I couldn't dare to comprehend as a child. Of course, as we grow older, we learn that the world isn't so full of magic and happiness as we are led to believe. Take, for instance, the story of Jack and Jill. Jack and Jill went up a hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after. A small and charming story. But what if I told you of its origins and the sinister nature behind them? You see, in a town much like the one which these woods border, there once lived a young couple and their newly born son. Their names were Jack and Jill Dawson, and they lived just on the outskirts of town at the edge of the woods. Jack was a laborer for the local steel mill, and Jill would stay home to tend to the small farm they kept and their son. Jack was always a bit of a drinker, but dove deeper into the swill shortly after their son was born, blaming it on the long hours he had to work now that they had a child. Every evening he would leave work and head to the bars on the upper side of town until late into the night. He would come home reeking of cheap booze and cheaper perfume. Jill would protest, stating that he needed to be home more with his son to help him grow into a man, and Jack would yell at her and head to bed, slamming the door behind him. Jill would now tend to their crying son and then fall asleep in the nursery. This went on for quite some time until one day she decided enough was enough. When Jack got home that night, she told him that she was leaving and taking their child with her. Fueled on whiskey and lack of sleep, Jack flew into a rage and smacked her to the ground. Jill hit the ground with a thunk and lied there motionless. Jack then went to their son's room and stood over the crib for a moment, staring blankly at their son. He had no real love for their son, but how dare anyone take what was rightfully his, he thought. He then knew what he must do. He took the child into his arms and made his way to the door. Just as he crossed the door frame, Jill slowly regained consciousness and grabbed for Jack's leg. He kicked her in the stomach and screamed, "I'll make sure you can't take anything of mine," and ran into the night. Her maternal instincts kicking in, Jill made it to her feet and ran after them. Jack was heading into the woods, running surprisingly fast for the amount of booze in his belly. Jill was desperate to keep up, her mind racing with why he was taking their child into the woods. A question that was soon answered as she came to a clearing just before the cliffside at the edge of the woods. At its edge stood Jack with her child, facing the chasm. Frantic, she instinctively picked up the first thing she could find and launched it at Jack, striking him in the head. As he wobbled and grabbed at his head, she looked in horror as his grip on her child loosened. She dove for him, but it was too late. She watched as her child disappeared into the black of the chasm, his screams fading into the abyss. As she lay on the ground sobbing, she heard Jack screaming at her. "Why would you throw a rock at me?" he said. "Look at what you've done." At this she rose and launched herself at Jack. Grabbing another rock, she slammed it into his skull over and over and over, until his head was nothing more than sticky red pulp. She stood up and looked longingly at the path home, the path towards the now empty and cold home, for a moment. Then she turned around and walked towards the edge of the cliff and plunged herself into the darkness to join her child. They say you can still hear Jill's sobs echo through those woods. Such a sad and tragic tale. It makes for a good children's story, doesn't it? Oh, is it that late already? I fear you must depart, my friend. It's best to not stay around these parts too late. You may find yourself lost to the dark.